Okay, friends, this is Dr. Stilman Joseph. It's a pleasure uh, to return back to the Center for Faith, Reason, and Dialogue, where we bring culture, religious studies, and history of ideas together in conversation. Uh, Today, I'm excited. I'm very excited to have my friend. It's a pleasure to have Dr. David Tonghou Ngong, right?
Ngong.
Ngong?
Ngong.
Yeah, yes. Uh, and our platform, Center for Faith, Reason, and Dialogue. In 2023, David published an important book, Senghor's Eucharist, Negritude in African Political Theology. And I invited David, to have a conversation. This is what we're going to have a conversation about the importance of this book, the importance of Senghor and African political theology. David is a renowned African theologian. He has written many works, many articles, very prolific writer on, for example, on African perspective on salvation, any traditional Christian doctrines, right? David tries to look at those doctrines from an African framework perspective, right? To see, to tell the world this is how the African people think, because this is very important. Because theology, all theologies are contextualized, right? So it's a pleasure to have you, David.
Thank you. Thank you. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I look
Yeah,
forward to our conversation.
very good. Again, I would like to congratulate you on the publication of this excellent work. I've really enjoyed reading this book. It's creative, it's innovative, and you make some very powerful arguments for some powerful claims. And the book was published by Baylor University Press. So, as I mentioned before, you are a prominent African theologian from Cameroon. By
Yes.
the way,
Yes.
let me brag. Let me brag. I'm 46% Cameroonian by my DNA ancestry. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't know
Yes, sir.
that.
46%. That's very high.
Yes. Yes. I didn't know that.
Yes, sir. So I appreciate your scholarship on African theology and the religious experience of the African people. So let's begin. How did you get interested in theology as a career?
Well, I think it's a long story. I think I can attribute some of that to my, background, my upbringing. I spent much time in a Catholic institution. I was trained in the Catholic institution for 7 years. So I think that rubbed some on me. But I would say, for me, the point at which I became quite interested in theology was when I was called to preach at my church, back in Cameroon. At the time, I had a bachelor's degree. My first degree was in English, and I was called by my church to preach. But I didn't think that I was well equipped, to be the kind of preacher I think I should be. So I thought I should study more. I should study more about the Bible and stuff like that. That is how I came to theology.
Okay. But you went
That
on to get
I
to do
I
your
went on to
master's.
study. Yes, I went on to study theology at the University of South Africa in Pretoria, which you also I
Yes.
understand you also studied there.
Mhm.
Then I went on to seminary here in the United States, and then to Baylor University where I did my PhD.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was my trajectory,
Mhm.
basically.
That's good. That's good. Now, did you go to Schuett Seminary at Baylor?
No, I did.
Or
No,
you
I
okay.
didn't. I went to the Department of Religion.
Okay.
The
Mhm.
Truett Seminary is separate from the
From the Department of
university,
Religion. Yes,
from the
yes.
Department of Religion. Yes.
Okay. So you do have a rich background. So you were exposed to Christian theology at an early. So you were raised in a Christian family.
Well, again, that is complex. My mother,
Yes.
my mother, as a matter of fact, my mother was the Christian in our home. My father was not. My father was a traditionalist. He practiced our indigenous traditions. You
Okay.
know, he was the one who introduced us to our indigenous traditions. Who would um, um, perform sacrifices that were needed, for relevant issues that were going on at home. You know, he's the one who connected us to our ancestors. But
Yeah.
mother took us to church. So it was my mother who took me to church.
So
So our
mhm,
home was some kind of a religiously syncretistic home, if you like. We did both our traditional religious
mhm,
activities and
mhm.
also Christianity.
I think it's a good benefit because you've benefited from both perspectives. One is the tradition that preserves the culture, you know,
Yes,
and I'm not, by any means, I'm not saying Christianity is not African. We know Christianity is very African,
right,
from the
right,
beginning, right?
right, right, right.
But you have your mother, I mean your father, who keeps you grounded right on the traditions of the elders. You have
Yes.
the mother, who nurtured you into the Christian faith.
Yes, yes. So both of that, which I think perhaps that is one of the things that draw me to Negritude, and to Senghor, because Senghor also has a similar kind of upbringing. He is steeped in his tradition, in his indigenous tradition. At the same time, he's very proficient in Christianity. So so I
Yes,
think perhaps there's some kind of connection that we have there.
I'm glad you brought that because that's going to be my next conversation with you. You know, it's interesting. So traditionally, theologians in general, right? They do not interact with creative writers such as
Right.
poets and novelists. But you, as a theologian, right? You chose to break the barrier.
Right, right. Well, I should say that it is not unheard of for theologians to engage with creative writers. There's a long tradition of that, as you yourself. I think you yourself, you are a good
I,
example of that.
I try to follow you.
you know, you're a good example of that. Of what you have done.
Yeah.
And even in the tradition of African theological writing, which is where I place myself, there has been call, to marry theological thinking and literature and literary work. That some of that has been done. They are here and there, dotted works that engage, literature and African theology. But I think literature being a creative work is really important in expanding the imagination of theology, because it is not just based on, what is there, what is the fact on the ground, which is something that theologians often consider, but it leads to some kind of imaginative flight, brings in perspective connections, make connections that are not easily done. So, for example, Senghor, you read Senghor's work. His work is placed within the context of what you may call, what has been called a Black Atlantic, and so
Tradition.
it is. Yes, it is very international in nature. It,
Mhm.
it breaks it breaks a kind of bounded nature of African theology as a way of thinking that is
Mm,
limited to the continent.
mm,
Senghor brings in the diaspora, into conversation
mm.
with African theological thought, which I thought is fascinating and something that needs to be done even more and more. That is one of the things that I really admire in engaging the literary work of Senghor.
We know Senghor was one of the architects of the Negritude movement that began in Paris, France, in the
Right.
1930s. There was Aimé Césaire, and of course, Léon Gontard.
You're right.
So
The heady one.
yes, the Trinity, right? The Trinity of the
Yes.
Negritude, right? So Senghor as the father. Leo always said they called me the Holy Spirit. In many conversations, he said that. He's the Holy Spirit. He's the one behind the scene.
Right. Right.
But we understand, like you said before, Senghor was a giant thinker, a Black Atlantic thinker. He interacts with writers everywhere, the Harlem Renaissance, Haitian intellectuals. He's everywhere, you know?
French philosophical and theological thought, the development in anthropology, Senghor is a significant point, to begin entering all of this, because these are intellectual traditions that actually began and flourished in his time, and he engaged all of them in his thinking.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Senghor. Things that you, for example, you use Senghor, not only you use his collective work and in the collection of poems called Black Host
You're right.
to do political theology. But there's something remarkable about this guy. Would you take a minute or two, give us a little background about this Senghor?
Well, Senghor, of course, he came from what is Senegal today, which was not what it was when he, was doing his political activity. Trained in the Roman Catholic tradition, I think he had the hope of becoming a priest. It didn't happen, because it is said that he was very feisty, and one missionary was not happy with his apparent outspokenness. So he was dismissed, he was not recommended to become a priest, which he saw as a kind of blow to him. And so one of the things that I do in this book is to say that here I am helping him to fulfill his original vision of becoming a priest.
Oh, yes. That's right.
So
you did Senghor as a priest.
So yeah. Yes, so he is here. I make him a celebrant of the mass, which is what he wanted to do. So he wanted to become a priest. That didn't work out. He ended up having a scholarship to go to France, to study. He went over there and studied and qualified as a teacher, and taught for a while. Became a French citizen, was conscripted, fought in the Second World War for France, was captured by the Nazis, almost killed, survived, and then eventually became, a great politician in West Africa and the first president of Senegal. But he is also a very controversial figure, in the sense that some people see him as one who had a soft spot for Europe, a soft spot for France, to the extent that it may be that he had more the interest of France at heart, than the interest of Africans. So there are these what may be called perhaps weaknesses in him, that should be accounted for. And I don't want to seem like I undermine those apparent weaknesses. In the end, when he came out of the presidency, he went to France, where he spent the rest of his life. So did not spend his life in Africa. So some people tend to see him perhaps as a traitor, even.
Not only that, he married a French woman.
Right.
Some people see that.
Exactly. He made what may be called incriminating incriminating statements, like Europe is raising, Africa is emotion, something like that. Which scholars have been trying to explain away, for a while now. But he's a complex figure, and I think that is one of his attractiveness. That complex complexity. But I think he is also a very astute politician.
Mhm.
You know, when he became a politician, you know, down in the trenches,
Mhm.
you know, applying political tools that he believed would, you know, perhaps help him survive as a politician.
Mhm.
And I don't know, help Senegal, I don't know. Again, many Senegalese
Mm.
would not think, many Senegalese would not, Senegalese scholars, you know, many of them would not think that he helped Senegal. You know, they see him as some kind of a dictator, you know.
Right, right, right.
So he's quite a complex figure when it comes to that. But I think that for me, I think that his importance for me lies in thinking about him beyond his political activity.
Mhm.
You know, I
Yes.
think he has left for us a purpose that if we take seriously, may throw light on some other things in our own time. You know, that is why he is important for me, right? It is not just his political life. I don't limit him to only his political life. I think we
Mhm.
should go beyond that a bit, you know, by considering his imaginative work that may open spaces for us,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, I think let me take it from there because this is very important to use his work to open space. Because you see, in your book, you use Senghor's poetry, his ideas as a framework to guide your discussion, right? And some of the
Right.
major themes, right, in the book, for example, Christology, communion, reparation, suffering, forgiveness, and reconciliation. You also use Senghor to articulate your personal discontent with the colonial system in Africa, with chattel
Right.
slavery in the
Right.
African diaspora, right?
Right.
But another interesting, you also use Senghor to articulate counter arguments against global capitalism, you know, and its pitfalls in Africa and the African diaspora, you
Right.
know. But what's interesting, I mean, you've done a wonderful work, not because you're my friend. Okay, no, this is a
Thank
great
you.
book.
Thank
This is
you.
a great book. Here's my question for you, David.
Yes.
Why do we need to turn to the work of Senghor to find healing in what you call in the deeply wounded world? I'm using
Yes.
your very, yeah.
Yes. Um, you know, the most controversial aspect of the book and the most controversial aspect of Austin Noir, Black Host,
Mhm.
is the fact that Senghor says that the suffering of Africans, the suffering of Black people in the world,
Mhm.
could be offered up as some kind of atonement
Mm.
for the world to find healing.
Mhm.
And through that, he offers forgiveness to colonizers,
Mhm.
right? He offers forgiveness to enslavers,
Mhm.
which is a very controversial thing to do. Now, we are dealing with dynamics of colonialism around the world right now, the afterlives of colonialism, the
Mhm.
suffering, the death, the
Mhm.
pathos
Mm.
that it leaves in its wake, right? We have experiences of all of that now, and people are not just, so willing to forgive, you know.
Mm.
Why should the victimized
Mm.
forgive, those
Mm.
victimizing them,
Mm.
right? Why should the victimized forgive the victimizers, right? Now, this language of forgiveness is a language that has not been opened in the first place in terms of these dynamics of wounded relationships, wounded international relationships, which is where I place this book. So this book is a kind of thinking about international relations. And I'm asking the question, is forgiveness possible in international relations, right? So the question of forgiveness has not even been raised
Mhm.
when we speak of colonialism, right? Forgiveness would require talking about what went on, some kind of confession about what went on, some kind of coming to terms with what went on. A dynamic that is not even happening. The conversation is not even happening now. There is acrimony, yes, but the conversation about, okay, how should former colonizers and former colonized, what kind of relationship should they have, not only in society but also in the church? It is not something that is even talked about. So in a sense, this is opening a kind of conversation that has this, starting a conversation that has not happened. Right. So Senghor helps us to begin to think about that space. How do we live together coming out of this history of hurt and pain? How is it possible? We are living together now. We are somehow managing to live together. But it doesn't seem to be ideal in any way. It doesn't seem to be ideal relationship that we have. Sometimes the church itself may seem to be a kind of hostile territory, to this kind of thinking. How do you live together in the wake of colonialism, in the wake of enslavement? In this, society is divided, the church is divided. I think Senghor helps us to begin to think about that. Is forgiveness possible? Right? What do we need to do in order to, reach a point where we can have some kind of non-enmity existence, which is essentially the world the world we live in now is a world of enmity, right? It is a world in which, on the face of it, it seems like we are okay, but actually we are not. The story is told in the wars. The story is told in the deaths. The story is told in the exploitation. The story is told in the continuous, ignominious place of Africa in the world. The story is told in the drowning of Africans in the Mediterranean Sea. The story is told, in all these, dynamics of death that we have. How do we begin to, think about the international order in which we live in such a way that would bring dignity, to everyone, especially to Africans, right?
But you also, in the book, you also highlighted the paradox in Senghor's body of work, right? Especially in his the collection of Black Posts. Yes. On one hand, Senghor talk about global communion. On the other hand, he talks about the refusal of communion. What a paradox.
Yes. And this, so colonialism and its afterlife, right? That is the refusal of communion. You see, in Black Host, Senghor catalogs the different way, the description of Europe, especially where he's describing Europe in terms of being cold and wintry and deadly. The clanging and fire, the bombing of war, especially in the Second World War. So this is actually a world that denies communion, right? It denies friendship. He's speaking of France. He says France gives with the right hand while taking away with the left. So there's some kind of hypocrisy, that is going on here in terms of how people live together, right? So ideally, when you think of the Eucharist, the Christian Eucharist, it is a place where people gather to celebrate redemption, to celebrate community, to celebrate togetherness. But for Senghor, the Eucharist that Europe offers is a denial of communion, because in everything from colonialism to slavery to the wars and conscription of Africans, the killing of the Senegalese tirailleurs, all of these are dynamics of death, which are all denial of communion. The relationship between Africa and Europe, the relationship between Africa and the United States, these relationships are all relationships of denial, that the push, Africa away, even though Africa is central to the creation of Europe. Africa is central to the creation of the United States, but Africa's existence is often denied and pushed away, right? So Senghor wants to turn this around. He wants to imagine something different, and he thinks that this something different may come through some kind of forgiveness.
Yeah.
But one of the things I'm saying in the book is that I'm asking if his offer of forgiveness is too hasty, if it is too cheap, if you think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who talked of cheap grace, right?
Yes.
So is this offering of forgiveness cheap and hasty, and does it diminish the lives of Africans, which is what many people would say. You cannot forgive your victimizer. You cannot just forgive your victimizer where there has been no discussion in the first place. There has been no repentance, no acknowledgement of guilt. Right? The story now is one of rewriting the history of colonialism. If you look in Europe, in Britain especially, there are many who are invested in rewriting, denying the history of colonialism. Right? So there can't be a kind of peaceful existence, friendship. There can't be friendship where we haven't come to terms with all of this, right?
It's interesting how you show in the book how Senghor uses Christology or Christology as a theme to make a connection, an intimate connection between the suffering of the African people,
right,
and continental Africa, and the African people in the Black diaspora.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is a strong theme. He compares our collective suffering with the suffering of Jesus Christ.
Right. And I think there is the key issue, and that Senghor does not just say, the suffering of Africans is like the suffering of Jesus Christ. He says the suffering of Africans is
yes.
It is the suffering of Jesus Christ. Which is like saying, it reminds me, of James Cone.
James Cone, yeah.
The tree, the cross and the
yes.
lynching tree.
Yes.
But Cone is making kind of connection over time. But Senghor is not doing that. He's some kind of displacing the cross and saying that, well, you think about the cross, but I want you to focus on these Black lives that are being destroyed here, right? These Black lives, this is the cross. And if you say that you value someone who died on the cross, if you claim to value Christ who died on the cross, then you should pay attention here. You should pay attention to what is going on here, because here is the cross, right? Here is the cross. This suffering, this is the cross. Now, what are you going to do with it? Right. So I think he is throwing this question out there. So it is not just that he has offered the forgiveness, but now it is incumbent. Now, if you value this, if you value the Christ that you talk about, I have thrown open forgiveness here to you, the forgiveness that is connected to Christ. Now, what do you do with it? How are you going to respond to it? Right. So it is at the same time a kind of invitation to imagine life otherwise, right?
So you also turn to Jean-Marc Ella.
Yes.
Yeah. This is very important, because a brilliant theologian.
Yes.
When you're talking about the notion of Eucharist, and I want to read something that you quote. The Eucharist is an event that not only dramatizes the past, but requires that the vision held in the past be made manifest in the present.
Yes.
Then You continue by stating the elements of bread and wine used in the Eucharist therefore raise regarding the church implication in racial capitalism and imperialism that specifically strangles Africans.
Right.
Then you also said an act that is meant to enact sharing and self-giving instead becomes the locus of the eating of the other.
Yes.
Can you, this is deep. You know,
Yes.
the church's implication in racial capitalism.
Yes. By the way, I should say, Jean-Marc Ella, I knew him first before. He is the one who helped me to interpret Senghor. You know, his little book, African Cry. You know, that is where this idea of communion is addressed. And he addresses that, you know, within his, you know, Jean-Marc Ella is seen as someone who marries, he brings together the theology of inculturation and the theology of liberation. But which I think is quite, you know, appropriate. You know, he's a fascinating theologian when it comes to that. And one of the things that he does in his theology of inculturation, you know, which is one of the things that some African scholars have been talking about in terms of how do you perform the Eucharist in Africa, right? How do you perform communion? You know, in the Catholic tradition, the Eucharist is performed using the bread and the wine.
Yes.
And Jean-Marc Ella says that the bread is created using wheat, you know, it's wheat bread, you know. And in Africa, in Cameroon, so this is Cameroon, not everywhere in Africa. In Cameroon, we don't produce wheat bread, right? So we don't grow wine also. We don't grow grapes we don't grow grapes in Cameroon to produce wine. Now, how do we get these things? How do we get them? Right? We have to order them, you know, from abroad, you know, from Europe or from the United States. Jean-Marc Ella says. Now, when you do this, Cameroon money is going to Europe. Cameroon money is going to Europe to create jobs there. Right? If we grew these things in Cameroon, then we can say, okay, we will use our resources to perform the Eucharist. But when we buy it from Europe and send our money to Europe to get these elements of bread and wine to perform the Eucharist, when we do that, we are, in essence, sending away Cameroon money brought to Europe, creating jobs in Europe, even as Cameroonians don't have jobs. So this is an act of communion. Communion is enacting, you know, thanksgiving, enacting unity, enacting friendship. But in this friendship is rooted exploitation, capitalist exploitation right there, right? Which is, you know, thinking of in terms of, you know, Senghor's Eucharist, in terms of the book, it is a way of eating the other. You know, it's a way of eating the other. It is consumption that consumes the other, consumes Africans, you know, in this process, right? Ella said, okay, what if we use some kind of food that is created in Africa? What if we use, you know, plantain or millet or something else that we grow in Africa, right? Then in Cameroon, then we won't have to buy the things from Europe. But the church would not allow the Eucharist to be performed in any other way. You know, it is against the tradition to perform the Eucharist using elements that are not bread and wine. And Ella was saying that we could use different elements. You know, Jesus used the elements that were available to him in his context. So we could use what is available to us in our context. But the church doesn't allow that. By not allowing that, the church is, in a way, participating in exploitation of Africans right in the midst of participating in the Eucharist. Right? That is how an event, you know, that is meant to be a place of getting together, of coming together, of sharing, becomes a place of exploitation.
And this is where theology of enculturation is important. You know?
Yes, it is. It is important. You see, but you see the depth connection. You see the dexterity with which Ella does this, right? Ella is a very creative. He was a sociologist and a theologian, you know. So he made very creative connection. He's not just saying that, oh, well, we are African, so we need to use African elements. You know, he is connecting it to capitalist exploitation.
Yes.
Right. And that is what makes Ella a key liberation theologian in Africa. Right.
Wow. So now in chapter 5, you know, this is what you wrote. You wrote Senghor's vision is not just a peaceful interpersonal and national coexistence. You insist it's a peaceful international coexistence. So we're going back to that question, the question of global communion. How do forgiveness? So when do forgiveness and reconciliation become a problem in relation to Africa's relations to the West?
Yes. Well, you know, I don't know if you have been following developments in South Africa, you know, after apartheid. After apartheid, one of the things that happened there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I'm sure you know you've worked on that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, that was led, you know, by Desmond Tutu. People are blaming him today, you know, for they are calling him, you know, and Nelson Mandela, they are calling them sellouts, you know. Because they offered cheap forgiveness to those who enacted apartheid. You know, they gave them cheap forgiveness, and the situation did not change. You know, the black people are still, in many ways, you know, many of them are still in the same position where they were during apartheid than they were. They are still where they were, you know, during apartheid, you know, and not much change has happened, right? So how does forgiveness work here? So for many, you know, forgiveness is a treacherous ground. It's a treacherous thing to do, you know, which is why I think that we need to think really carefully about it. And one of the you know theologians, one of the scholars who helped me to think about this is actually the biblical scholar, you know, Musa Dube, who comes from Botswana. You know, she has written a beautiful piece, you know, on forgiveness, on the Lord's Prayer. You know, focusing on what forgiveness should look like in the context of the colonizer and the colonized. You know, she says that for forgiveness to work here, there has to be a stop to exploitative relationship, right? Forgiveness is not a panacea to anything. It may actually sell out, you know, the colonized. There need to be some kind of movement. So what Senghor offers here, as I said earlier, is opening up a space for this kind of conversation to begin. It is not even something that is talked about. Now it is talked about mostly in acrimonious, you know, terms, you know, mostly in terms of denial, rewriting of colonial history, justifying colonialism and things like that, you know. So I think that the space that Senghor opens here is to say that now we should think carefully, especially from a Christian perspective, which is how I see him, which is how I engage him. You know, we should think really carefully of what role forgiveness may play here. For people who call themselves Christian, forgiveness is a central dynamic. But how should forgiveness work? This is a life issue, which I think needs careful consideration.
But David, it seems to me in your interpretation of Senghor's ideas, you try not to divorce forgiveness and reparation. In fact, you call as you're talking about navigate through the notion of forgiveness. You call reparation as a form of world making. And for you, without reparation, forgiveness is impossible. And without which, we cannot remake the world. We cannot heal the world.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. You know, and whenever whenever we talk about a reparation, people always think in terms of paying money,
Mhm.
giving money to people. I try to dispel that in this work. That is not reparation. The word reparation comes from repair. Is to fix something, that's broken.
Yes.
And there are many ways. There are many ways to repair things. So the point here is to repair a relationship,
Mhm.
that is broken. And I think that specific moves need to be made,
Mhm.
in the relationship that Africa has with the West. Africa has had a really fraught relationship with the West. And everyone now knows that the way Africa is, the way Africans live in the world, has been marked
Mm.
in some very harmful ways by Africa's relationship with the West, right? And these ways need to be addressed. Specific policies, specific
Mm.
things
Mhm.
need to be enacted, in order to create a kind of world in which the history of exploitation, the dehumanization, the animalization of Africans would not continue to repeat itself.
Mm.
Now we live in a cycle where it continues on and on and on. Now, all of this is because Africa is central to the world. Africa is central to how the world has become. And how Africa has become has been shaped by the modern world,
Mhm.
right? I think dynamics of Africa's entry into the modern world need to be revisited, which are being revisited, and addressed, by scholars. But in terms of the politics, there has been very, very little, if any, movement, right? We are still captured in many ways by the politics of death that brought Africa into the modern world.
It seems to me this is a similar problem that we have and in the Caribbean tradition
Yes,
among theologians,
yes,
where theologians they do theology, the abstract, the conceptual,
yes,
but they don't
yes,
see the relationship between theology and praxis, the real life experience. This is why we need liberation theology. And I
exactly.
think this is where in your book you make a call for African theologians and biblical scholars to read African novelists and poets because African novelists and poets, just like Caribbean novelists and poets or African American novelists, they are activists.
Exactly.
They are political thinkers. I'm not saying theologians are not African theologians or Caribbean theologians are not political thinkers. I think that we need to turn, right. We need to have a
Yes.
conversation, with African novelists and poets. They're more politically conscious, don't you? You know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. You're right. You're right. And I think theologians are also very politically conscious.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the case of South Africa, I think
Yes,
many
yes, that's
many
true.
people,
Mm-hmm.
many of the people who are today in the government of South Africa, many of them studied theology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, so they're activists in a
Mm-hmm.
way, but by and large,
Mm-hmm.
theology has not been concerned in this. And I think perhaps theology is an academic endeavor. We are sitting in the ivory tower and writing things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it has some effect on how theology brings itself into these conversations. But for me, theology is a matter of life and death.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I remember, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who said that if God calls a person, God has called you to come and die, something like that,
Yes,
which was
yes.
one of the first, which was one of the first things that I was told when I began reading theology, so it becomes something, it's a very personal thing, which deals with the sufferings that we have gone through, the sufferings that we are still, right? So I come from a rural area. I don't come from a bourgeois background. I come from a rural area, and I write with the rural area in my mind, in my imagination, and I see still the suffering that people are going through. Cameroon in my day when I was growing up is quite different from what it is. Was quite different from what it is now. You would think that as time passes, things will get better. But, with time, Cameroon has actually descended, even more into violence and death. Life has become, just unlivable for many people. So all of this, shapes what I try to do in my theological work. So it is speaking, speaking these truths which I think need to be spoken, putting them in the public sphere, so that somehow we may begin to talk about them just like we are doing now. And I hope that people will watch this, and see that, oh, there is this dynamic of relation that we have, with Africa. This relation that Europe has with Africa. This relation which is actually destructive in many ways, exploitative
So
in
in
many
other
ways.
words, you're asking the question, what does theology have to say about the suffering of black of the African people? What does theology have to
Exactly.
say about Europe's and America's bad policies?
Exactly. Exactly. Europe and America's, implication in this. That is why I think Senghor is really important, because he makes this connection.
Yes.
Right? He makes this connection so explicitly in a way that is not ordinarily done in African theology. Much of African theology, although, speaks of Africa in the world, how Africa has been affected by the world, but it always seems as if it is just an African thing. Africa looks like an island. So let's think about, how do Africans think about God, for example? I think that is okay. We can think about that, right? But the lives of African people in the world is not affected only by Africa. The lives of African people in the world is affected by the international dynamics, international politics. Yes. Right? Every single African country is rooted in this dynamic. Imagine China, for example, would invite African presidents, and African presidents would just run to China. The United States has a relationship with Africa, U.S.-Africa relationship, one country having a relationship with the whole continent, UK-African relation, one country, a relationship with the whole continent. You see, in all of these dynamics, Africa is diminished, dehumanized, exploited, in ways that continue to cause massive death for people. And I think theology must engage these issues. There is no other way. I don't know that there is something that is far more important than this. And this is something that I think Senghor, who lived long ago, helps us to think about, in a very creative way, right now. And I think that perhaps one of the best things that Christians in Europe, Christians in the United States, Christians in other parts of the world outside of Africa, I think one of the best things that they can do is to think about these international relationships. How are these dynamics affecting Africans? I think that they could play a significant part in beginning this conversation so that we may begin to transform the world in a way that is livable, not only for people in Europe and the United States, and Canada and Australia or so, but also for people in Africa, many of whom are living in dynamics of violence that make life short and
To me,
deadly.
David, it begins with theological education. How the West or America train people for the ministry. For I mean,
Right.
for theologians to write theological books, for people with a concern for mission, world mission, for example, since we're
Right.
talking about Africa,
Right.
their ideology when let's say when they before they leave Europe
Exactly.
and Africa go to or America go to Africa for mission,
Exactly.
because as we know, missionaries some missionaries, I don't want to generalize this, are complicit, you know, in what's
Exactly.
going on.
Which is why again in the text I talk about all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um glo- global mission,
Mission. Yeah.
is complicit, in
Yes.
this, because
Yes.
people just do missionary work as if it's a matter of just going over there, and talking to people about Jesus and so on
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. You know, um, in the 70s, I think, there was
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
African theology and all over the world, there was what was called a moratorium, a
Yes.
moratorium debate, where some Christians, in Africa, Asia, um, they said that missionaries should not come,
Mm-hmm.
that the churches were just beginning
Mm-hmm.
to grow, and missionaries should stop to Africa so that Africans can begin to take charge
Mm-hmm.
of the churches. They can begin to grow the churches for themselves.
Yes.
You know, and one of the most interesting things is that Christianity flourished in Africa. After missionaries. After
Mm.
missionaries. Left. Not when they were there. So one of the things I do in Senghor's Eucharist in this book is to say that, perhaps we could place a moratorium on mission work also now,
Yes.
in order to talk about this relationship of exploitation which Africa has with Euro-America, right? I
Mm.
think because putting a moratorium would bring to the fore, will elevate these international dynamics of exploitation. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example.
Mm.
Everyone is just going there, dividing the place, killing people, cutting resources away.
Mm.
All of this is done with the clear view of many Christian people even participating in it,
Mm.
right? So missionaries, they go there, they don't say anything about that. These international dynamics, it is
Mm.
like this is how the world should be. This is how the world is, which I think is incredibly wrong.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Senghor's Eucharist Senghor, I think Senghor does for us, is to say that we should, let's stand back, take a look at this international relationship that we have, how Africa is being diminished, humiliated, dehumanized, condemned in the international arena, right? Because what is going on in Africa is not just what Africans are doing, it is also what the world is doing to Africa,
For Africa.
right? It is what the world is doing to Africa. And I think we need a moment to pause and say, let's look at what the world is doing to Africa.
But at the same time, David, you try to balance. You try to do an internal critique of African politics.
Yes,
You also
yes,
talk to African leaders. For example, when you are talking about slavery, you
yes,
said slavery is not the past. You said
yes.
it's happening right now on the
Ye-
continent.
yes, yes. Again, this is part. I'm still doing some work, on
Mm-hmm.
African theology and slavery in Africa, which I think is something that has not been raised,
Mm-hmm.
significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and one of the things that I'm seeing, in the reading that I'm doing is that there is some kind of afterlife of African slavery in Africa. Right? The way that people are treated now, for example, many African political leaders just don't respect Africans at all. Many of them are not even accountable to Africans, right? So if you take like Paul Biya, for example, Paul Biya doesn't think that he's accountable to Cameroonians, right? It's like Cameroon is a kind of personal property for him. Right, which is the case, with many other African leaders. In Togo, it's the same thing, right? Africans are being killed, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them. Deaths will happen in Europe, and they will be concerned about the deaths in Europe, but deaths will happen in Africa, and they will not be concerned about them.
Yeah.
So African lives are just valueless for many of these leaders in Africa. Many of them are accountable to Europe. Yeah. They are accountable to the United States than they are to Africans. Right. So in all of this, I'm not just saying, well, let's blame the West, let's blame Europe, let's blame the United States. That far from that. I know, being from Cameroon, I know that what Cameroonians do, especially Cameroonian politicians, what Africans do, especially African politicians, contribute a lot in dehumanizing us. So we talk of reparation. Reparation is a very complex idea when it comes to the context in Cameroon. If you're going to give, you cannot say you give money. You cannot money to the government of Paul Biya, a government that is fleecing people, a government that is, contributing in the dehumanization of Cameroon. They cannot go and give the money to give Cameroonians. They don't give Cameroonians anything. They don't help them. The Cameroon state doesn't help Cameroonians in any way. So you can't walk through the way it is now, to bring the kind of transformed world that we are thinking of. Right, even that too, the way we think need to change. The way we do things, need to change.
This is where the prophetic vision of the church could make a tremendous radical transformation in society and in the political sphere,
yes. And I must say, the church, it is a dangerous business. The prophetic vision is a dangerous business in Africa and perhaps in other places around the world. In Latin America, for example, there's a trail of deaths of people who have tried to be prophetic, right? Jean-Marc Ella died in Canada. He was run from Cameroon. He was run out of town, right? Before that, Father Anjebemveng was killed. People who try to have, play prophetic roles. This is a treacherous thing. So
there's a cost.
Yes. Yes, it is a dangerous thing. So I am careful with how I talk about prophetic, vision of the church. I think the church should be prophetic, but also I know it is very risky. Right? It is a very risky business. Perhaps, a person may want to say a prophetic word, but there are all kinds of dynamics that play into their thinking, that will prevent them from saying what they think. Right? And perhaps now in much of Africa, the kind of Christianity that people value is not a prophetic Christianity. Pentecostalism is the dynamic Christianity in Africa now. And Pentecostalism is not a prophetic form of Christianity. Pentecostalism is it is part of governments in Africa. If you go to Ghana, you go to Nigeria, you go to Cameroon. Pentecostal preachers, they are the people who are cozy with the state.
Wow.
Right. So it is a dangerous business, but also the kind of Christianity that is emerging in much of Africa is not one that encourages prophetic imagination. But I think that we must develop prophetic imagination. It is a risky thing, but it is not something we can do without.
Wow. So what are you currently working on now?
Well,
is there a sequel?
well, right now, I am just trying to finish the semester. I'm just trying. I have a slew of projects, which I'm going to give shape to, during the summer. I don't normally write during the semesters, because I'm teaching. Also in the family, there's a lot going on in the family, so it's hard during the semester to be able to, put my thoughts together. So there are things I'm working on right now, but I'm going to give shape to them over the summer. So if you ask me this question, perhaps in November, I'll have something concrete to say.
So
perhaps in November, I'll have something concrete to say.
Yeah, in November when I see you at what is it? Where AAR?
Yes, I think San Diego. Yes, if you ask me in San Diego, I think I'll have something to say. Because then I should have put my thoughts into shape. There are quite a number of things I'm working on right now, so I'm going to try to give some shape to them.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate this conversation with you about your excellent book, Senghor's Eucharist, Negritude in African Political Theology, published by Baylor University Press. Guys, go get your copy. Thanks for writing this book. I really do. You have a last word for our audience?
Hey, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope that something we have said here today, will pique your imagination, and that you may find a place to be involved in the process, in the process of creating a kind of more faithful world, more transformed world in which the lives of African people will not be continuously diminished.
Thank you so much, David. You have like 3 to 4 weeks left for the semester to be over. I hope you take the time to rest and then enjoy your family.
Thank you. And same to you. Say hello to your family for me.
All right. Thank you, guys. Again, this is Dr. Stilman Joseph from Center for Faith, Reason, and Dialogue.